Hello, welcome to my channel Nick Room. Like and subscribe. Miss, first class is for those who can afford it, the steward said with a barely noticeable sneer, blocking the way of the dark-skinned woman who had just settled into the wide seat of first class. She lifted her eyes from her phone and calmly looked at the man, whose uniform with the airline's emblem gleamed under the cabin lights. Her gaze was steady, without aggression. "Excuse me, this is my seat," she replied calmly and handed him her boarding pass. The steward frowned. His eyes scanned the ticket, lingering on her last name, and he raised an eyebrow with suspicion. "Where did you get this ticket?" he asked, as if she were not a passenger, but someone caught doing something suspicious. The woman, keeping her tone even, repeated, "I bought it just like every other passenger." From nearby seats, several people began to watch the scene out of the corners of their eyes. Their looks mixed curiosity with faint amusement. Some were clearly wondering how this woman could possibly end up in first class. "Excuse me, but first class isn't a tourist flight," a stewardess interjected, joining her colleague. Her voice was softer, but doubt still laced her words. "These tickets cost a great deal of money." "I'm aware," the passenger replied evenly, slipping the boarding pass back into her bag. "But do you check the financial background of every passenger who sits here?" The crew exchanged glances. In their eyes was the unspoken thought. She, a black woman, could hardly afford a ticket worth tens of thousands of dollars. "We'll need to confirm this with administration," the steward said. "You see, there have been cases of fraud." The woman smiled faintly. There was no joy in that smile-only patience. She knew her calmness must look like defiance to them. "Of course. Go ahead and confirm," she answered, leaning slightly back in her seat. She pulled out a book as if their suspicion meant nothing to her. But inside, a storm was rising. This wasn't the first time people doubted her right to be where she didn't belong. While the steward contacted the shift supervisor, the stewardess lingered nearby. "Tell me, where do you work?" she asked politely, though her eyes betrayed genuine bewilderment. "Perhaps you won this ticket in some sort of promotion." The woman set the book down and looked her straight in the eyes. "Do you ask that question to every passenger, or only me?" The question hung in the air, making the young woman in uniform blush and avert her gaze in silence. A few minutes later, the senior flight attendant arrived. His steps were firm, and his eyes immediately swept over the woman with a shade of severity. "Madam, we have doubts about the authenticity of your ticket. You'll need to be temporarily moved to economy class until everything is verified," he declared in an official tone, as if handing down a sentence. A murmur rippled through the cabin. A few passengers in expensive suits smirked. Some even smiled, satisfied that justice was about to be served. The woman slowly closed her book, laid it on her lap, and looked at the flight attendant in a way that made him lose his breath for a moment. "You're asking me to move based on what? The color of my skin? Or your assumption that I couldn't possibly afford the ticket I held in my hands?" He faltered, but quickly recovered his businesslike tone. "This is just a standard procedure, madam." She tilted her head slightly, as if in agreement. But inside, she was boiling. She longed to reveal the truth that she was the owner of this airline, the one who signed their contracts and decided who would wear the logo on their chests. Instead, she drew a deep breath and said, "Very well. Go ahead and check. You'll have time to realize just how mistaken your assumptions are." She knew. Sometimes you had to let people go too far in their prejudice so the lesson would be truly learned. The plane was preparing for takeoff. Passengers whispered, and the crew still nervously discussed the case of the suspicious woman. No one suspected that in just a few hours, when the plane landed, many of them would regret every word they had spoken. The woman remained seated in first class, refusing to let others' distrust shatter her composure. She had learned to wear a mask of serenity, even when a storm raged inside her. A few minutes later, the senior flight attendant returned, this time with 2 ground staff members who had been summoned at the last moment. Their presence seemed excessive, as if she was some kind of threat, though all she had done was sit in her rightful seat. "Madam, We need to make sure your ticket is authentic, one of the staff said coldly, holding a tablet in his hands. Could you please show us an identification document? She calmly took out her passport and handed it over. The man scrutinized it for a long time, squinting as if even an official document could conceal deception. Did you buy this ticket yourself? He pressed. Or did someone else give it to you? The woman's reply was quiet but firm. I purchased it myself. You doubt this only because you're not used to seeing someone like me here. Her voice was calm, yet every word sliced through the air. One of the men coughed nervously, but the flight attendant, his face like stone, continued. We have to check situations like this. Unfortunately, people often try to sneak into first class illegally. She slowly retrieved her documents and placed them back in her bag. The cabin fell into tense silence. A few passengers in the back were openly whispering now. I knew something was off, declared a woman in an expensive pantsuit. She just looks too. She trailed off, but everyone understood what she meant. The man next to her chuckled quietly. Of course, it's laughable to even think she paid tens of thousands of dollars for that ticket. The words reached the woman's ears, but she didn't flinch. She was used to hearing doubts, used to feeling the cold stares that all but said, "You don't belong in our world." The irony was that she was the one who had built this world. Not only could she afford the ticket, she owned an entire fleet of planes. But revealing the truth too soon would rob them of their lesson. Could you please move, just until we finish our checks? The senior flight attendant repeated. It won't take long. She looked at him calmly, though her eyes blazed with resolve. I am not moving. You may run as many checks as you like, but I will remain where I belong. Irritation flickered in his gaze. He was used to passengers complying, but this woman showed no fear. Madam, don't force us to, he began, but stopped short when her eyes locked onto his. A long pause stretched between them before he abruptly turned and walked away. The passenger beside her, a young woman of European appearance, looked at her with sympathy. Forgive them, she whispered. They just don't understand. They understand, the woman replied softly. They just pretend not to. The plane began taxiing toward the runway. The atmosphere in first class remained tense. Some continued whispering, others simply stared at her as though she was some rare oddity. But the black woman sat calmly. She knew. The moment of truth lay ahead. After takeoff, the chief flight attendant reappeared in first class. In his hands was the same tablet, and on his face, the expression of someone ready at last to deliver a verdict. Madam, I must apologize, but your last name does not match the information in our system. It's possible you received this ticket from another passenger, he said. The cabin filled with murmurs again. Several people exchanged smug looks, convinced the exposure was near. But the woman only gave a faint smile. Are you sure you're looking at the right system? She asked, her tone carrying a hint of irony. We have only one database, madam, the flight attendant replied firmly. Believe me, she said quietly, leaning closer. That database belongs to me. He recoiled, not immediately grasping the meaning of her words. She leaned back again and opened her book. She had no intention of revealing her hand. Not yet. Let them sink deeper into their prejudice, so their fall would be harder. The long hours of flight dragged on under tension. The crew kept casting wary glances at her, as though expecting her to slip up at any moment. But she sat calmly, refusing to let them strip her of her dignity. Every remark, every doubtful glance was a reminder. In a world where money and power could decide everything, skin color could still be used as a pretext for humiliation. But she intended to turn that humiliation into a lesson, because true strength was not shouting nor revenge. True strength was endurance. The plane was preparing to land, and she knew, soon, on the ground, they would face a surprise that would change everything. Landing was approaching. The city lights were already flickering through the windows, but first class was wrapped in silence. broken only by the soft rustle of pages from the book the woman was reading. For her, reading wasn't just a way to pass time. It was armor, shielding her emotions, while others continued their attempts to put her in her place. "We'll be on the ground soon." The senior flight attendant appeared again, his voice cold and businesslike. "I need to ask once more. Where did you get your ticket?" The woman slowly closed her book, marking the page with her fingers. "I've already answered. How many more times do you need to hear it?" "Understand, madam." He said the word as though it tasted unpleasant. "We are obliged to ensure flight security. Sometimes people sneak into first class illegally. And usually these people look like me?" Her question was so direct that the man paled slightly. Instead of answering, he stepped back and glanced at the passengers. They were watching with great interest. A few nodded, as if to agree with his suspicions. "I've seen this before," said a man in his 50s, seated across the aisle. "Sometimes scammers pose as business clients. I would check too." "Exactly," chimed in a woman with pearl earrings. "She doesn't look like she belongs to our circle." Her words rang out loudly, almost theatrically, provoking soft laughter among those nearby. The black woman remained silent. Her face stayed calm, though inside she was seething. She understood perfectly. These people believed they had the right to decide who was worthy to sit among them, and who wasn't. For them, her skin color automatically made her suspect. "You know," she finally said, quietly but audibly enough for everyone, "every time I find myself in situations like this, I wonder, have people really not learned to see beyond skin?" The cabin fell silent again. Her words cut too sharply, too painfully. But no one dared to reply. After landing, a sleek black car pulled up to the jet bridge. The first-class passengers began gathering their things, whispering among themselves. "Probably here for some businessmen," said the same man who had spoken earlier about scammers. "Or a politician," guessed the woman in pearls. The steward, the very one who had first questioned her right to sit in first class, approached her again. "Madam, we'll need to hold you at the exit. Our services are still verifying your ticket." She looked at him with quiet weariness. "You're so afraid I might actually belong exactly where I am?" He scowled, but didn't answer. When the cabin door opened, passengers lined up to disembark. A few lingered deliberately, eager to see how this story would end. And then a man in a sharp suit appeared at the jet bridge. His presence was impeccable. Confident stride, steady gaze, faint smile. In his hands, he held a tablet with the airline's emblem. He walked straight to the woman who was still in her seat and bowed his head respectfully. "Mrs. Wilson, the car is ready. They're expecting you at the office, but you have time to stop home first if you wish." The cabin froze in stunned silence. The steward standing nearby seemed to turn to stone. His face went pale, his eyes wide. Several passengers too sat speechless. "Mrs. Who?" gasped the woman with pearls. But no one answered her. The black woman rose calmly, adjusted her coat, and took her bag. "Thank you for your concern," she said to the crew. "I always appreciate when staff are so diligent about order, especially when that order is rooted in prejudice and disrespect." Her words were quiet, but every single person heard them. She walked down the aisle with majesty, as though the plane itself belonged to her, which, in truth, it did. But the truth stayed with her. For now, she knew another conversation lay ahead. A conversation that would put everything in its place. Outside, the cold air brushed her face, but in her chest burned fire. She knew the crew inside had not yet fully realized the mistake they had made. They had only seen a hint. The real lesson awaited them tomorrow, when she would walk into the company office, no longer a suspicious passenger, but the very person whose name stood first on the list of the airline's owners. The next morning, the headquarters of the airline gleamed in the first rays of the sun. The tall glass building reflected the blue sky, while at the entrance, employees bustled about, some with coffee, some with folders, some glancing nervously at the stern clock mounted on the facade. A black car smoothly stopped at the main entrance. Out stepped the same woman, yesterday's suspicious passenger. Today, her walk was different. Not just calm, but commanding. She wasn't in a hurry, but each step seemed to set the rhythm of the space around her. The guard at the door immediately opened the glass doors wide for her, bowing his head respectfully. Inside, the air buzzed with business. The ring of phones, the shuffle of papers, the clack of heels against the marble floor. But as soon as she passed the reception desk, the young administrator leapt to her feet. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," she said reverently. "Your office is ready." The woman nodded without slowing her stride. Meanwhile, on another floor, in a meeting room, sat the very same senior flight attendant. He had been summoned to a debriefing about yesterday's flight. He didn't understand why it was necessary to report so urgently about a minor incident, but the tension in his chest was growing. "We were just following instructions," he justified himself before the head of service. "The passenger was far too calm, and that seemed suspicious." "Too calm?" the manager repeated, frowning. "And that was enough reason for you to humiliate a client?" "I didn't humiliate anyone," the attendant exclaimed. I only wanted to make sure the ticket was genuine." The people gathered around exchanged glances. In the air lingered the sense that he was facing a far more serious problem than he had imagined. Meanwhile, the woman entered her office. The spacious room with panoramic windows overlooked the city. On the massive desk were neatly stacked documents, the morning press, and a cup of coffee prepared exactly the way she liked it. She sank into her chair and ran her hand over the smooth surface of the desk. The looks, the sneers, the biting remarks from yesterday resurfaced in her memory. Every time her dignity was questioned just because of her skin color, she felt the same weight, as if the walls were closing in around her. But now the walls belonged to her, and those who had tried to humiliate her yesterday would have to bow their heads today. The phone rang. Her secretary informed her that the representatives of Flight 547's crew were already gathered in the conference hall. The woman smiled. There was no malice in her smile, only firm resolve. She rose and walked to the door. The conference hall greeted her with tense silence. The employees, who only yesterday had felt like masters of the situation, now sat awkwardly, avoiding her gaze. Among them were the steward, the stewardess, and the senior flight attendant. When she entered, everyone stood. She walked to the center and, pausing to look at each of them, said, "Yesterday, you questioned my right to sit in first class. You decided that the color of my skin made me suspicious. You asked questions you never ask other passengers." The room was silent. No one dared interrupt. You thought you were protecting order, but in reality, you were humiliating a person. And you did it confidently, because you believed the system would always be on your side. She paused. The senior flight attendant raised his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of fear in them. "But the system belongs to me," she continued, "and it is you who must explain why your idea of order is discrimination." Her words landed with the weight of a blow. The employees exchanged nervous glances. Someone swallowed hard. Someone else opened their mouth to speak, but thought better of it. The woman walked slowly across the room. "I don't want to humiliate you in return. But I want you to understand, every word, every look is not just a mistake. It's a choice. And for that choice, you are responsible." Her voice carried such authority that the people in the room felt a tightness in their chests. The sudden realization that yesterday they had laughed at the woman who owned everything they relied upon. Suddenly, the door opened, and a representative of the board of directors entered. In his hands was a folder of documents. He bowed to the woman and said, "Mrs. Wilson, the board requests your immediate presence in the main hall. All the executives are gathered, and the matter concerns yesterday's incident." The woman nodded and turned to those present. "We are not finished," she said. Then she left. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor. She knew. What awaited downstairs was not just a discussion of disciplinary measures, it was a challenge of far greater scale. Word had already begun to spread that the owner of the airline had been humiliated on her own plane, and how she chose to act now would set an example for hundreds of employees and passengers. She stopped at the doors of the hall, took a deep breath, and pushed them open. Inside, dozens of eyes turned toward her, all focused only on her. The boardroom was silent, broken only by the low hum of the air conditioners. The massive oval table was covered with folders and tablets, each place marked by a nameplate. But all eyes were fixed only on her. The dark-skinned woman walked in with a confident stride and stopped at the head of the table. No one dared to sit first. Their gazes held not just respect, but fear mixed with guilt. Mrs. Wilson, the chairman of the board, finally spoke, a grey-haired man with a heavy voice. Yesterday, a very unfortunate incident occurred. We would like to offer you our apologies. An unfortunate incident, she repeated, raising an eyebrow. That's what you call it? The man coughed and looked away. Yes, of course, it was unacceptable. The crew has already submitted their reports. We will conduct an internal investigation and take measures. She stepped forward. You speak of an investigation, but there is no mystery here. It's obvious. I was humiliated not because there were doubts about the ticket, but because there were doubts about me, about who I am, about my right to sit where the so-called respected passengers sit. A murmur swept the room. Some board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Unfortunately, one of the female directors said cautiously, such prejudices still exist, but we are certain that your achievements— My achievements? Mrs. Wilson cut her off. Are you saying I should be respected only because I own this company? That if I were just a doctor, a teacher, or a mother, you would have had the right to treat me differently? The question hung heavy in the air. No one found words to answer. Discrimination doesn't stop being discrimination when the victim happens to be wealthy, she continued. Yesterday, I wasn't the owner of an airline. I was just a passenger. And I was humiliated in the same way thousands are humiliated every single day. Without cameras, without witnesses, without consequences. Her voice grew firmer with every word, and shame deepened on the directors' faces. You fear consequences, she said, scanning the room. You fear the news will leak to the press, that customers will start asking questions, that shares will drop. But I want you to fear something else, that your employees, wearing the emblem of this company, are using their power to demean others. The chairman tried to interject, We understand the seriousness, Mrs. Wilson, but perhaps it would be best to resolve this matter quietly. Her sharp look silenced him. Quietly? Her voice rang like steel. You want to silence the problem again? Pretend nothing happened? She walked to the window and paused, gazing at the city below. Cars, crowds, the hum of the metropolis, each life moving forward, unaware that justice itself was being weighed in this very room. All my life I've faced this, she went on, softer now, almost to herself. At school, when teachers were surprised by my grades. At university, when professors doubted I wrote my own papers. At business meetings, when partners assumed I was an assistant, not the owner. And even on a plane that belongs to me. She turned back to the room. And every time I was told, it's just a mistake, a misunderstanding. But there are too many mistakes, too many misunderstandings. The truth is, it's a system, one in which some are always believed, and others are always doubted. Silence fell. Everyone knew she wasn't speaking just about herself. She was speaking for millions. I will not be silent, she declared at last. I want this case to be an example. I want every employee to understand, disrespect is not a trifle. It is a violation of human dignity. And there will be consequences. The chairman lowered his eyes. Some directors tried to speak, but their words stuck in their throats. At that moment, the door opened, and several journalists entered. Cameras flashed. The secretary hurried to explain. Mrs. Wilson, it was impossible to hold them back. They learned about yesterday's flight. The woman smiled faintly. She knew. Now her words would be heard, not only by those around the table, but by the entire world. She stood tall, shoulders squared, and stepped forward toward the cameras. "Since you are here," she said to the journalists, "then it's time to tell the truth." And the room exploded with flashes of light. Camera flashes blinded like hundreds of tiny lightning bolts. Journalists flooded into the hall, holding recorders, cameras, and phones. The noise of voices instantly filled the space. "Mrs. Wilson, is it true that the crew of your own plane accused you of fraud? Is it true they tried to force you into economy class? Do you consider this an act of racial discrimination?" The woman raised her hand, and relative silence fell over the room. Her confident gesture silenced even the most persistent reporters. "Yesterday," she began firmly, looking straight into the cameras, "I was flying on a plane owned by my company. I was seated in first class. I had my ticket, my documents, and every right to be there. But the staff decided otherwise." She paused, letting her words settle. Even the directors at the table shifted uneasily under her gaze. "They did not see a passenger in me," she continued. "They saw only the color of my skin, and that alone was enough to doubt my integrity." A ripple of whispers swept the hall, and the flashes lit her face again. I was asked questions no other passenger would ever be asked. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the strength of emotion. "Where did you get this ticket? Did you buy it yourself? Maybe it was some promotion. These were not safety checks. They were doubts cast on my dignity." One journalist tried to interject, "But the staff claims they were following protocol." "Protocol?" She cut him off. "No protocol says a black woman must be scrutinized more than a white man. That's not protocol. That's prejudice." Her eyes swept over the board members. They lowered their gazes, realizing the public nature of the confrontation left no room to bury the matter in internal reviews. At that moment, the door opened again, and in walked the senior flight attendant from yesterday's flight. His face was pale, his hands clenched nervously around a folder. He clearly had not expected cameras and reporters here. "Mrs. Wilson?" he began, his voice quivering. She turned to him. "Yesterday you told me that first class was for those who can afford it. Are you sure you want to repeat that today in front of the press?" The hall froze. Cameras zoomed in on the man. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. "You wanted to put me in my place," she went on. "But now it's you who must find your place." His knees shook, as though he might collapse through the floor. The journalists exchanged glances. Some were already drafting headlines. "Airline owner humiliated on her own flight. Racism in first class, the story shaking the industry." But she didn't rush to destroy her opponents. Instead, she raised her voice, addressing the cameras. "This story is not about me being the owner of the company. It is not about money or power. It is about the fact that even the most successful among us face prejudice. And if someone like me, a woman at the head of this corporation, can be treated this way, then imagine how those without the means to defend themselves are treated." Her words sounded like a verdict, not against individuals, but against the entire system. "I want you all to understand," she pressed on. "Yesterday's flight is a mirror. It shows that in our society, questioning a person's dignity based solely on their skin color is still considered normal. And as long as this mirror exists, no one can say the problem is solved." Reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing. One asked, "What measures do you plan to take?" She let a pause hang in the air. "There will be measures," she said at last. "But I don't want the consequences to fall only on those who tried to humiliate me yesterday. I want the consequences to be felt by society as a whole." Her voice carried like a force, as if it could pierce the walls and spread far beyond the building. The senior flight attendant couldn't bear it anymore. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She turned to him, holding his gaze. "Forgiveness comes after understanding. And right now, you don't even understand what you've done." His face darkened with shame. At that moment, a man from the press office entered. He bent toward one of the directors and whispered something quickly. The director's face drained of color as he looked up at her. "Mrs. Wilson," he began, his voice shaking. "The story has already gone international. Calls are coming from New York, London, Paris. We must take action immediately." She slowly turned to the board. "Yes, we must, but not for reputation, for truth." And with those words, she stepped forward to the council table, as though preparing to announce a decision that would change not only the company, but the entire aviation industry. The hall was so silent that the faint thud of an elevator on an upper floor could be heard. Cameras kept flashing, journalists exchanged looks in anticipation, and the board members, like cornered animals, sat motionless. Mrs. Wilson scanned the room. There was no rage in her eyes, only strength and firmness, which made people feel their guilt more sharply than any shouting ever could. "I hear you," she finally said, her voice even, yet each word seemed to carve through the air. "You fear for stocks, for reputation, for your seats, but why don't you fear for people, for those your employees greet every day with prejudice in their eyes?" Her words sounded like a verdict passed on an entire system. "I will not cover up what happened, and I will not let you call it a mistake. A mistake is when coffee is served incorrectly. But when someone is humiliated because of their skin color, that is a choice, a conscious one, and choices always have consequences." Several board members lowered their eyes. One director, a middle-aged man known for his toughness, tried to object. "But if we start acknowledging such cases publicly, we risk damaging the company." She turned her gaze sharply on him. "Damage to the company doesn't come from acknowledgements. Damage to the company comes from humiliations committed in its uniform." His words died on his lips, and he fell silent. The journalists broke in again, talking over one another. "What steps will be taken? Will you fire the crew? Will there be a new company-wide program?" Mrs. Wilson raised her hand, and silence fell again. "I don't intend to act for the sake of a headline," she said. "My goal is not simply to punish a few people. My goal is to change the culture." She paused, then continued. "Yes, there will be consequences. Those who showed prejudice yesterday will be held accountable. But that's not enough. If we stop at dismissals, tomorrow new people will take their place, carrying the same biases. The system will remain unchanged." Her voice carried unshakable resolve. "I want a program that touches every employee, from interns to executives. Training, real policies, real measures. I want everyone to understand. Discrimination is not a personal opinion. It is a violation, and violations have consequences." The journalists scribbled furiously while the board sat as though under crushing weight. At that moment, one of the directors, an older man long considered old school, stood and said, "But Mrs. Wilson, what if the public thinks you are exaggerating? That you're using your personal case to frame the company as guilty?" She met his eyes. "If the public thinks discrimination is trivial, then the public needs a lesson, and it is our duty to give that lesson." His lips trembled, and he sat back down, wordless. Cameras clicked again. One reporter called out loudly, "Are you ready to address the passengers of your airline?" She hesitated for just a moment. In her mind flickered memories. Yesterday's whispers in first class, the woman in pearl earrings saying with disdain, "She isn't one of us." Those voices echoed society itself. "Yes," she said firmly, "but not only the passengers. I will speak to everyone who thinks they have the right to judge another's worth by the color of their skin." The journalists exchanged glances. This was not just an answer, but a promise of a major address. A secretary entered quietly. "Mrs. Wilson, representatives of the international press are waiting. They want an official statement." She nodded and turned to the board. "You have time to decide what matters more, keeping your seats or keeping the dignity of this company. I've already made my decision." With that, she turned and headed for the exit. In the corridor, she was surrounded by reporters, cameras, microphones. She paused for a moment, breathed deeply, and lifted her head. Inside, the pain of yesterday's humiliation still burned, but that pain had become a weapon, the weapon of truth, which could not be silenced. She entered the main hall, where dozens of media representatives were already gathered. People rose to their feet, turning toward her. "Mrs. Wilson, tell us what happened," came a question. She stepped onto the small podium in the center, placed her hands on the microphone, and said, "Yesterday, I was a passenger. Today, I stand here as the owner of an airline. But this story is not about me. This story is about the fact that discrimination is alive. And as long as we pretend it is just a misunderstanding, it will continue to thrive." The murmur of voices died away. Everyone waited for her next words. "I want you to hear this," she said, looking straight into the cameras. "Everyone who thinks skin color determines human worth must understand. That ends here." She paused. The hall was absolutely silent. And just then, a voice rang out behind her. "But the world will not change with words. What are you prepared to do?" The phrase from the crowd hung in the air. Cameras swung in unison to capture the moment. Journalists froze, waiting for Mrs. Wilson's reply. She slowly raised her eyes, scanning the hall full of reporters, board members, and employees gathered at the doors. "You're right," she said quietly, yet her voice carried as if the walls themselves amplified it. "The world will not change with words alone. Words are the beginning. But they must be followed by action." She stepped forward, placing her hands firmly on the podium. "First, we will launch an independent investigation. Every case of discrimination on our flights will be documented and reviewed. Never again will anyone hear that their complaint is too hard to verify or just a misunderstanding." The journalists scribbled furiously as flashes exploded once more. "Second, every employee of this company," she emphasized, looking directly into the cameras, "will undergo mandatory training, from pilots to cleaners. And it will not be a formality. It will be real work, on themselves, on their perspectives, on the culture they create." Among the employees present, murmurs spread. Some looked uneasy, others frightened. But Mrs. Wilson did not waver. "Third, I will personally oversee the implementation of these measures, because trust in our airline does not begin with comfortable seats or gourmet meals. It begins with respect for every passenger." A heavy silence followed. Then, inevitably, someone asked the question hanging in the air since morning, "And what will happen to the crew who treated you the way they did yesterday?" The entire hall froze. Cameras turned toward her. Somewhere in the crowd, the faces of the steward and stewardess were pale, eyes full of fear. "They will face a disciplinary hearing," she said calmly. "But this is not only about them. If I punish only these individuals, tomorrow their places will be filled by others with the same prejudices. The problem runs deeper. It lies in the culture of the company." The tension in the room deepened. The journalists exchanged glances. She wasn't seeking easy solutions. Then a young reporter with burning eyes dared to ask the question everyone feared. "Mrs. Wilson, what if society doesn't support your measures? What if people say, 'You're exaggerating. You're turning a personal case into a tragedy?'" She smiled faintly, but the smile carried more bitterness than joy. "Then," she answered, "that will only mean I must push harder. Because as long as even one person thinks discrimination is a small thing, it will continue to exist." Her words rang out like a vow. The board members sat crushed. They had expected the incident to be resolved quietly. Now it had grown beyond their control to the world stage. More questions fired from the journalists. "Will you expand this program to international flights? How have your partners in Europe and Asia responded? Will you cooperate with human rights organizations?" She answered without hesitation, "Yes, yes, and yes." Each word struck like a final chord that could not be disputed. In the crowd, a woman in her 40s, with a weary face but keen eyes, raised her hand. And what would you say to the passengers who laughed yesterday? The ones who were glad when they thought you'd be sent back to economy? Mrs. Wilson was silent for a moment. It was a difficult question. She remembered their cold, mocking, condescending stares. She remembered the woman with pearl earrings saying with disdain, "She doesn't belong to our circle." "I would say to them," she answered slowly, "that their circle is too small. The real world is larger, and in that world, there is room for everyone." Her words were unexpectedly gentle, so much so that a muted gasp passed through the hall. She wasn't calling for vengeance. She was offering expansion, and in doing so, she stripped away their sense of superiority. But then her phone rang. On the screen flashed a name, an international partner, the head of a major European airline. All eyes turned to her. The journalists went silent. Would she answer? She looked at the phone, then back at the cameras. Perhaps this call will decide how far our initiative goes. She pressed accept and raised the phone to her ear. "Yes, I'm listening," she said, and in the silence of the hall, everyone could hear the sound of someone nervously swallowing. The phone in her hand seemed to become the center of the entire hall. Cameras fixed on her every gesture, every glance. Even the board members, who moments ago had tried to hide behind formal phrases, now watched her with unease and tension. "Yes, I'm listening," she repeated into the receiver. The hall was silent, broken only by the clicking of cameras and the scratching of journalists' pens. The voice on the other end was low, businesslike, with a faint French accent. "Mrs. Wilson, this is Dubois. I hope I haven't caught you at a bad time?" She smiled faintly. "On the contrary," she said, "you've caught me at a moment of truth." There was a pause on the line. Then he spoke carefully. "Here in Europe, the newspapers are already writing. The scandal is growing. Some investors are concerned. You must realize that your words yesterday and today could affect international markets." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I understand perfectly. But it's strange to me that you worry about markets and not about what happened." "You see," he said cautiously, "our passengers value comfort and status. If your initiative is perceived as too radical, they may turn away." Her voice rang with cold steel. "If they turn away only because I demand respect for every human being, then they were never truly our passengers." The hall froze. The journalists could barely resist applauding. Their eyes burned, knowing every word was tomorrow's headline. "Mrs. Wilson," Dubois spoke again, now with uncertainty in his tone, "there are those who support you. Several of our partners in London and Berlin have already said they are ready to join your anti-discrimination program." She let out a breath of relief. "You see," she said, "change is always frightening, but the first step is always followed by the second. However," he added quickly, "there are also those who oppose it. The New York Stock Exchange is nervous. Some Asian partners are saying the issue is too politicized." She closed her eyes for a moment. How many times had she heard that word? Too. Too outspoken, too uncompromising, too black to sit in first class. "Tell them," she said firmly, "that discrimination has no borders. If they think they can remain on the sidelines, the world will soon force them to choose." Silence on the line. Then Dubois said quietly, "You understand you're going against the system?" She smiled, this time broadly, openly. "I've always gone against the system. That's exactly why I stand here today, and not where they wanted me to be yesterday." And without giving him a chance to reply, she ended the call. The hall fell into silence again, but this silence was different, charged, expectant. The journalists glanced at each other, ready to erupt with questions. The board looked crushed, as though they finally understood. There was no going back. "Well then," she said, placing the phone on the podium, "it seems the whole world is watching us now." The weary-faced journalist in the front row asked, "And what will you tell the world?" Mrs. Wilson raised her eyes to the cameras. I'll tell them that the world can no longer afford the luxury of silence. Her voice grew stronger, carrying across the room. I address every passenger, every employee, every person hearing me. If you believe human worth can be measured by skin color, hear me clearly. That era is ending. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward. Her words were more than a speech. They were a manifesto. At that moment, an assistant burst into the hall, pale and breathless. He whispered something to the chairman of the board, and the man went even paler. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice trembling, "we've just learned. Social media has exploded. Millions of posts already. Your name is trending worldwide. But with the support also comes a wave of criticism. You're being accused of exaggerating and of placing yourself above others." She gave a sad smile. "Of course," she said, "there will always be those who claim that fighting for dignity is just drama. It's easier for them to believe the problem is imagined." Her eyes sharpened like a blade. "But this time they're wrong, because I will not stop." Journalists leapt up, shouting questions. "What's next? How will you counter the criticism? What will you tell investors?" She drew a deep breath, as though ready to answer them all at once. But at that very moment, the doors swung open, and a delegation in dark suits entered. The company's largest investors. Their faces were tense, their steps brisk. They stopped directly in front of the podium. One of them spoke. "Mrs. Wilson, we need to talk. Now." The room froze. Cameras swiveled to capture the new confrontation. She looked at them calmly, though a spark flashed in her eyes. "Yes," she said, "I believe it's about time." The investors entered the hall as if determined to seize control. Their sharp suits, gleaming briefcases, and cold expressions radiated confidence in their own power. Cameras instantly turned toward them. The journalists knew the most important moment was about to begin. One of them, a tall man with graying temples, stepped forward. His voice was even, but carried the weight of command. "Mrs. Wilson, we understand your feelings, but you must immediately stop your public statements." "Sis," she raised an eyebrow. "Stop?" she repeated. "Yes," said another investor, a woman with narrow eyes and a cold gaze. "You are turning a personal conflict into an international scandal. This threatens the company, its image, and most importantly, its profits." The journalists exchanged glances. Several cameras zoomed in on the investors' faces, eager to capture every emotion. "Profit," she repeated slowly. "It all comes down to profit?" The man with graying temples frowned. "We are accountable to shareholders. If the stock falls, thousands of jobs will be at risk. You must think of the company's future." "The company's future?" Her voice rang with steel. "And what future will it have if it is built on silent complicity with discrimination?" The investors shifted uneasily, but she did not allow them to speak. "You fear the loss of millions. I fear the loss of human dignity. Tell me, which is more important?" The hall fell silent. Cameras captured every second of the clash. The woman investor crossed her arms and said coldly, "We can remove you from leadership if you continue to go against the interests of the shareholders." Her words caused a stir among the journalists. Several jumped from their seats. "Remove the owner?" echoed across the hall. Mrs. Wilson looked at her calmly. "Try it," she said quietly. "And then you'll have to explain to the world why you removed the one person demanding respect for your passengers." The man with graying temples stepped closer, his voice growing harsher. "This is not about respect. This is about power. Either you align your decisions with us, or—" She cut him off. "Or what? You'll destroy the company just to preserve the old order?" He faltered, his eyes flickering with the realization that she would not back down. The journalists devoured every word. Some were already sending headlines to their editors. "Investors vs. Wilson, a clash at the highest level. Battle for the airline, profit versus dignity." The tension in the hall was like the air before a storm. "Listen," interjected a third investor, younger, with softer features. His tone was gentler, though still weighted with pressure. We're not denying discrimination exists, but such changes must be introduced gradually, carefully. Society isn't ready. Mrs. Wilson regarded him with irony. Society isn't ready? And when will it be? In a year? 10 years? A century? How many more people must suffer humiliation before you say, now it's time? The young investor lowered his eyes. His argument collapsed to dust. She stepped forward, now standing face to face with the delegation. Cameras captured the moment. A black woman in a sharp suit, regal and composed, standing against a group of investors trying to suppress her. I will not allow you to stop me, she said firmly. This company grew because of me, and it will change with me, whether you like it or not. She turned toward the hall and added, and if anyone believes that human dignity is an obstacle to profit, then perhaps they should find themselves another company. The journalists erupted with questions. The investors paled. The board of directors looked as though the ground was giving way beneath them. And just then, her phone rang. On the screen was a name, an international news channel, live broadcast. She glanced at the investors, then at the cameras. It seems the world wants to hear even more, she said, pressing accept. Mrs. Wilson, came the voice of the anchor, you are live on air right now. Millions of people around the world are listening. What do you want to say to them? The hall froze. She lifted her head, drew in a breath, and said, I want you to know. The hall was so silent that the sound of a journalist dropping a pen echoed like thunder. Cameras flashed, capturing her every move, while on the other side of the live broadcast, millions of people held their breath. Mrs. Wilson straightened, placed her palms on the podium, and began to speak. I want you to know, yesterday, aboard a plane owned by my airline, I faced what millions of people face every day. I was questioned not because of my documents, not because of my ticket, but because of the color of my skin. There was no tremor in her voice. It rang firm, as though each word were carved in stone. I was seated in my place. I had a ticket, paid for honestly and officially, but for some that was not enough. To them, I wasn't a passenger. To them, I was someone who doesn't belong here. She paused, letting the cameras catch her gaze. Direct, stern, undeniable. I speak of this not to complain. I speak because the truth must be heard. If it can happen to me, the owner of an airline, imagine what it feels like every day for those without the power to defend themselves. A muffled gasp rippled among the journalists. Even the investors, who minutes ago tried to silence her, now sat with faces marked by shame or unease. Today, I want to speak to the entire world, she continued. We live in the 21st century. We pride ourselves on technology, on science, on art. We can build skyscrapers, launch rockets, create cures, but we have yet to learn the simplest thing of all, to respect one another. A resonant silence filled the room. No one dared to interrupt. How much longer will we waste time proving the obvious? That a person's worth is not in their expensive suit or their light skin, but in the fact that they are human. Her words streamed across the airwaves, spreading worldwide. Headlines were being typed in newsrooms, phones buzzed with alerts. I promise you, she said firmly, my company will be an example. We will create a system where there is no place for humiliation, where every passenger, in economy, business, or first class, will feel equal. She leaned slightly toward the camera, eyes locked on the lens. And if it costs us profit, so be it. Profit can be regained. Dignity cannot. The words set off an explosion of flashes and voices. But in that moment, an aide rushed in, pale and shaken. He whispered to the chairman of the board, who blanched even further. What is it? Mrs. Wilson asked. The chairman raised his eyes, his voice trembling. Your address is no longer confined here. It's being broadcast live across international networks. And thousands of passengers worldwide are sharing their stories. of humiliation, of bias, of racism. The hall gasped. Journalists scrambled for their phones, confirming headlines. Passengers share stories of discrimination after Wilson's speech. Social media explodes. A wave of confessions. Mrs. Wilson drew a deep breath. She understood this was the beginning of something far larger than a single scandal. One investor, still clinging to control, stammered, "This could spiral out of control. People will demand change not only here, but across the entire industry." She turned to him and replied, "That is exactly what I want." He went pale, as though he hadn't expected her to say it aloud. Journalists shouted questions. "Mrs. Wilson, are you ready to lead this movement? Will you work with other airlines? Aren't you afraid of threats and pressure?" She raised her hand, and again the room stilled. "I am not afraid. I've been silent too long. We've all been silent too long. The time has come to speak. The time has come to act." Her voice carried not just a promise, but the resolve to transform an industry. And just then, a young journalist, clutching a microphone, asked the question that cut through the air like a challenge. "But are you prepared to see this through, even if it costs you your company?" Every eye turned toward her. The board froze. The investors stiffened. She looked directly into the camera as though addressing not just the hall, but the millions beyond the screen. "If the price of justice is my company," she said quietly, yet with crystalline clarity, "then perhaps that is a fair price." And at that moment, the hall erupted, with shouts, flashes, and questions, the sound of history being written in real time. The hall drowned in noise, voices shouting, cameras flashing, journalists calling out questions. Mrs. Wilson's words, that she was ready to sacrifice her company for justice, had spread instantly, becoming a global sensation. On the other side of the screen, millions of people were posting comments, sharing videos and quotes. Social media was ablaze with hashtags: "Justice in the skies," "Wilson's speech," "Dignity for all." People shared their own experiences. Some recalled being humiliated at airport security. Others wrote about being denied business class seats. Still others spoke of years of biased treatment. "Mrs. Wilson," one journalist shouted above the noise, "do you understand that right now you're triggering a wave that could destroy not only your airline, but the entire industry?" She looked at him calmly. If the industry survives only by standing on humiliation and inequality, then yes, it must be torn down and rebuilt. Her words cracked like thunder. Even the investors sitting aside exchanged uneasy glances. In the corner of the hall, screens began streaming live footage from streets around the world. People marched with signs: "Dignity over profit." "We are all passengers of one world. No racism in the skies." Mrs. Wilson clenched her fists when she saw it. She understood. Her words had become a spark, and the fire was spreading faster than she had ever imagined. One of the investors snapped. "You don't understand what you're doing." His voice broke. "These protests will hit all of aviation. Flights will be cancelled. Jobs will be lost." She turned to him. "Jobs are already lost. Opportunities are already lost. Respect is lost every day when people are treated as unfit passengers. Why didn't that trouble you before?" He fell silent, lowering his eyes. Just then, the phone on the podium rang again. The screen flashed: "President of the International Air Transport Association." The journalists gasped. "Answer it," someone shouted. She picked up and switched to speaker. "Mrs. Wilson," came the stern voice, "you must stop these speeches immediately. You are undermining trust in aviation worldwide." "Trust?" She narrowed her eyes. "It's not my words that undermine trust. It's your silence when passengers are humiliated." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "You risk being left alone. No company will support you if you continue down this path." She smiled faintly. "You're wrong. I am not alone. Millions are with me." At that moment, applause broke out in the hall. First one journalist, then another, then almost everyone. The sound swelled into a roar that drowned even the clicking of cameras. The board of directors looked lost. The chairman tried to speak, but his words were swallowed by the noise. Mrs. Wilson raised her hand, and silence fell again. "I am not afraid to stand alone," she said, "but it seems I won't have to. People have already chosen." The screen behind her lit up with a world map dotted with points, spontaneous rallies of support erupting across the globe. New York, London, Cape Town, Tokyo, Rio de Janeiro. People were posting photos from airports, airplanes, city streets. She looked at the map, shivers running down her spine. Her words had become a movement. But with that came a new threat. A secretary rushed into the hall and whispered, "There are reports of threats. Some demand your immediate resignation. They say a woman should not lead the industry, that you are destroying tradition." Mrs. Wilson pressed her lips together. She had known this was inevitable. Every spark of support cast a shadow of hatred. "Let them speak," she said firmly. "I'm not here for them." The weary-faced journalist once again raised her hand. "Tell us honestly, are you prepared for the possibility that you'll be removed? That tomorrow you'll wake up no longer the owner of this company, but just a woman who dared to tell the truth?" Every eye fixed on her. It was the most direct question yet, leaving no room to deflect. Mrs. Wilson looked straight into the camera. "If tomorrow I wake up just a woman, then it will be the greatest title of my life, because I will still be a woman who did not betray herself or others." The hall erupted in applause, loud and long. But the screen behind her suddenly shifted to a breaking news ticker. Red letters scrolled across. "Aviation crisis. Major investors demand Wilson's resignation." The hall froze. Investors exchanged glances. The board looked as though it had just heard a death sentence. But she continued to stand tall, proud, with the same calm that had so irritated the flight attendants in first class the day before. "Well then," she said quietly, "it seems tomorrow will be even harder." She turned to the sea of journalists and added, "But tomorrow is exactly when we will find out who we truly are." The news ticker behind her kept flashing in alarming red. "Investors demand resignation. Scandal escalates. Global aviation crisis." The hall buzzed with noise. Journalists hurled questions. Investors whispered nervously among themselves, and the board of directors sat as if on pins and needles. Mrs. Wilson stood still, the eye of the storm. In her calmness, there was more strength than in all the threats surrounding her. "Mrs. Wilson," one journalist shouted, "will you step down voluntarily, or will you fight to the very end?" She paused. Hundreds of eyes, millions of viewers in the live broadcast, waited for her answer. "I will step down," she finally said, "only if I see that I've lost. But right now, I see the fight has only just begun." Her words struck like a challenge. The flashes of cameras grew even brighter. At that moment, the chairman of the board rose. His face was pale, but he tried to keep his voice firm. "The board will convene for an emergency session. We must discuss the future of the company's leadership." His words landed like a hammer blow. Gasps rippled through the hall. Journalists instantly relayed the update to their newsrooms. "You can't be serious?" she asked, turning to him. "Yesterday, I was humiliated on my own airplane. Today, millions around the world are standing with me. And right now, you want to remove me?" The chairman lowered his gaze. "We are obliged to think of stability." "Stability built on lies is an illusion," she shot back. "And that is exactly what you're trying to protect." Meanwhile, the screens behind her flickered with new footage. Live broadcasts from New York, London, Cape Town. People chanting with placards, "Wilson is with us. No more humiliation. Dignity over profit." Crowds swelled, joined by airport staff, flight attendants, and cabin crews from other airlines. One journalist shouted, "People are demanding that you stay. What will you tell them?" She looked at the screens, and for the first time in a long while, her eyes glistened with tears. "I will tell them thank you. And I will tell them I will not back down. But the investors weren't finished. The cold-eyed woman investor stood and declared, "Your emotions are touching, Mrs. Wilson, but business is not built on emotions. If you will not resign voluntarily, we will remove you legally." The hall erupted in outrage, but Mrs. Wilson raised her hand for silence. "Go ahead," she said firmly. "Try to remove me. But remember, you won't be removing me. You'll be removing the idea I represent. And ideas cannot be fired." Her words drew thunderous applause from journalists and employees in the hall. Even some board members looked at her with newfound respect. Suddenly, the lights went out. For a few seconds, the hall was in darkness, filled with startled voices. Then the screens lit up again. But now they showed dozens of videos from passengers around the world. They made me show my documents 3 times, while others were never asked once. They told me this seat was too good for me. I never flew first class, not because I couldn't pay, but because I knew I wouldn't be welcome there. One testimony after another. Real people, real stories. The hall sank into silence. Even the investors had no words. "This is why I fight," Mrs. Wilson said as the screens returned to the news feed. "For those who cannot defend themselves. For those the world forces into silence." She stepped forward and looked straight into the cameras. "I will not back down, even if I stand alone." But just then, her secretary rushed up and whispered urgently, "An emergency notice has come through. The board is preparing to vote. They could announce your removal this very evening." The hall gasped. Journalists erupted with questions. Mrs. Wilson drew a deep breath. Not a single muscle in her face twitched. "Let them vote," she said. "Let them decide. But let them know this. Their decision will go down in history." She turned back to the hall and added, "And tomorrow the world will judge not only me, but them." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for that same evening. The city buzzed like a beehive. News channels were broadcasting live. Crowds gathered in the streets, and outside the airline's headquarters, the crowd grew larger by the hour. Posters, chants, songs, all merged into a single rhythm. The office was surrounded by cameras and reporters. Hundreds chanted her name and raised signs. "Keep Wilson. Justice can't be fired. We are all passengers of the same sky." The roar carried all the way into the boardroom, and every member of the council knew. Whatever decision they made would be witnessed by millions. Inside, the air was heavy. A long table, soft chairs, muted lights. On one side, investors and their allies. On the other, board members, some of whom already showed signs of unease. Mrs. Wilson entered last. She didn't hide her fatigue, yet her posture radiated the same unshakable firmness. Her footsteps echoed across the marble floor. "The session is now open," the chairman announced, his voice struggling to stay steady. On the agenda, the retention or early termination of Mrs. Wilson's powers as CEO. His words were dry, but their weight was felt by all. The investors spoke first. The silver-haired man rose sharply. "Wilson has jeopardized the company. She dragged us into a political scandal. Our stocks are plummeting. Our partners threaten to pull contracts. She doesn't think about the future of the business." The cold-eyed woman added, "The company must bring profit, not become an arena for ideological experiments. If we don't stop her now, tomorrow our clients will flock to competitors." Their voices were confident, but laced with fear. When it was her turn, Mrs. Wilson stood. She didn't raise her voice, yet her words carried louder than any accusations. "You speak of profit, but what is the worth of profit if it's built on people's humiliation? You speak of customers, but what kind of customers are they, if their value is measured only by the thickness of their wallets?" She paused, scanning the room. "Yesterday, they tried to move me out of first class. Today, you want to move me out of this seat. But you know what? This isn't about a seat. It's about what our future will be." Several board members lowered their eyes. They knew this wasn't just a struggle for power, but a historic moment. Suddenly, from outside, the windows came a thunderous roar. The chants blended into one name. Wilson! Wilson! The council flinched. It was impossible to ignore. "Do you hear that?" she asked. "Those are the voices of the people our company exists for. Those who fly our planes, entrust us with their lives. And they are not asking for profit. They are demanding justice." The chairman closed his eyes as if trying to collect his thoughts. The vote began. Each board member was called to raise a hand, for or against dismissal. Cameras were barred from the room, but reporters and the crowd outside awaited the results like a verdict. The first hand rose for dismissal, the second also for, the third against. The roar outside grew louder, as if people somehow sensed the course of the vote. Mrs. Wilson sat straight, her face calm. She knew every flicker of her expression would be dissected. Inside, though, she boiled. Hand after hand rose. The balance hung by a thread. One wrong move, and everything could collapse. Finally, it came to the last member, an elderly man with gentle features, long considered neutral. The outcome rested in his hands. He looked up at Mrs. Wilson. He stared for a long moment, as if searching for an answer. Outside, the chanting thundered ever louder. Just then, the doors burst open. The secretary rushed in, breathless and pale. "Stop the vote," he cried. "Downstairs. Thousands of people. They've pushed through to the building and demand that Mrs. Wilson address them right now." The hall gasped. All eyes turned to her. She rose slowly, her face calm, but her eyes ablaze. "Looks like the decision isn't being made in here," she said. "It's time to answer them." The crowd outside the building roared like an ocean. Thousands had gathered at the airline's headquarters. Some held signs, others raised the flashlights on their phones, creating a sea of light. Their voices merged into a powerful rhythm. "Wilson! Wilson! Wilson!" The sound reached the upper floors, making the glass tremble. Mrs. Wilson stood at the massive front doors. Beside her were guards, shaken directors, and a swelling crowd of journalists. They tried to escort her to the exit, but she walked on her own, steady, unhurried, confident. When the doors swung open, the air filled with the thunder of voices. Thousands of eyes turned to her. People raised their hands, cried out, some even wept. She lifted her palm, and the crowd instantly fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to freeze, as if the world itself awaited her words. "Yesterday," she began, her voice clear despite the noise, "they tried to move me on a plane. I was told that first class was for those who could afford it." The crowd erupted in angry shouts. She raised her hand again. Silence returned. "But yesterday was not about a seat on a plane. It was about how we divide people into us and them, into worthy and unworthy, into those who are allowed at the front and those who are sent to the back." Her voice carried a strength that pierced every heart. "Today, you showed me that I am not alone. Today, the world heard not only my story, but your stories too. Stories of humiliation, stories of injustice, stories of pain." She paused. The crowd hung on her every word. "And today, I say, enough." The words cracked like thunder. The crowd exploded in applause, then hushed again as she went on. "I will not back down, even if the investors threaten me, even if they try to remove me, because this is not about me. It's about us. About everyone who has ever been told they don't belong." She raised her hand higher. "We live in one world. We fly in one sky. And in that sky, there is no place for divisions of skin color, gender, or origin." The crowd roared with applause. People chanted her name, many cried and embraced one another. Meanwhile, the board members watched from the upper floor. They realized the decision had already been made, not by them, but by the people. Any vote they cast now would look meaningless against such power. One investor muttered through clenched teeth, "We've lost." Another tried to argue, but fell silent, hearing thousands of voices chanting her name. Mrs. Wilson stepped forward, almost to the edge of the stairs, and declared, "I am staying. I will fight for every passenger, for every person, and if someone has a problem with that, let them step aside." Her words drowned in the roar of the crowd. People raised their hands, clapped, shouted her name. Later, the news would call this moment historic. It would be printed in textbooks as the speech at the airline headquarters. It would become a symbol that even one woman, wronged and humiliated, could change an entire industry if she dared to speak the truth. And no one would remember those who tried to put her in her place. But millions would remember her words. We are all passengers of the same sky.